Welcome to Chapter 7, where we're going to be looking at the political economy of global trade. So, in this chapter, we will be covering the following outcomes. In other words, after this chapter, you should be able to understand the term political economy, discuss how global trade has evolved over time, give reasons for trade barriers and also identify different trade barriers that exist, discuss the implications of these trade barriers, describe different instruments of trade policy, explain what is meant by dumping, and then explore the evolution of global trading arrangements and look at the future of global trade and look at how global trade is likely to develop in the future. So, the first concept that we look at is political economy. So what is a political economy? It's a study of production and trade and their relations with law, custom, and government, and with the distribution of national income and wealth. Okay, so the bottom line is that government influences international trade, i.e. it either makes international trade easier, so for other countries to sell their products and services within its borders, or it makes it more difficult for them to sell their products and services within their borders for various reasons. So government looks at how best to look after its own people's interests, and it uses various tools to do this based on their political and economic philosophy that they adhere to. So this results in particular policies in how resources will be allocated and how national interests will be protected at the end of the day. We have previously looked at the evolution of global trade, but it's as old as mankind. People have been trading across nations since history began, since different countries have different products available to them. They've needed to trade with each other in order to facilitate access to these products. So there's always been trade by barter, exchanging one product for another product. And later on barter was replaced with money, but essentially it's the same process. So the bottom line is no nation can satisfy all the needs or desires of the population by means of local production or resources alone. So we need foreign products. So the idea of duties or royalties or tariffs or different forms of taxes on foreign products is not new. It dates back to the Roman Empire, to Hadrian, to all these ancient empires, etc. They had tariffs on goods that moved through their lands or when goods were imported or exported from their lands. In the modern era, macroeconomic policies and political agendas play a big role in government's financial, fiscal, and monetary policy. So they put tariffs and non-tariff barriers in place in order to advance their own political agendas. If you want to see a good example of this, look at what is happening between the USA and China at the moment and their so-called trade war, where the USA is putting tariffs on Chinese goods entering the USA for various reasons, many of them political. So, government endeavors to regulate trade. So, they use various methods to protect their trade within their borders. So, they can do things to encourage the increase of local production they can earn increase local production in order to create a competitive advantage in local markets for goods produced within that country over other countries' goods that are imported. But this can also lead to international competitive advantage. For example, if a country subsidizes products that are produced within that country, it may make those products cheaper on the international market than anyone else can produce them. Okay, so let's create trade barriers. And a trade barrier is a tax or a tariff or a regulation that limits the amount of goods that can come in from another country. It does this for various reasons, or there are various arguments behind the creation of trade barriers. Okay, so the first argument is the protection of local jobs. So the argument is, if we keep out foreign products, you need to produce the products at home, and therefore local people will be employed in local factories, and thus local jobs are protected. The second argument is to substitute imports. So the assumption is the greater a economy becomes industrialized, i.e. the more factories and industries that are created within the economy, the greater the wealth will be of that economy. So the idea is that local products should be cheaper than imports, and to increase the market size for local products by keeping out foreign products. Thirdly, the protection of infant industries. Here, new industries are protected by tariffs that the government places on imported goods. For example, let's say South Africa decides to open a cell phone factory. The government could decide to protect this industry by placing a tariff of 1,000 Rand on every cell phone imported from overseas. So in order to make our local cell phones cheaper and thus make that cell phone factory viable, the government puts tariffs on products that come from overseas. The fourth reason is the reduction of reliance on foreign suppliers. So we do not want to be reliable or reliant on foreign countries for key products that we require to survive. For instance, you want to protect your agriculture because in times of drought, etc., you want to be able to provide for your people and not have to rely on another country that could cut off your supply. So by putting in protections such as tariffs, you encourage your local farmers to produce various agricultural products because it is still profitable for them, and you keep open your agricultural industry. Thirdly, attraction of local production and foreign investment. So if your local industries are protected, number one, it provides an incentive for local business people to start businesses because they know that they are protected from foreign competition, but it also creates an environment where foreign investors can come into the country and start businesses because they know that they will also be protected from foreign competition. So a good example here was in South Africa, where our telecommunications industry has been protected by government regulation for a long time, which prevented other role players coming into the market. The sixth reason is the reduction in balance of trade. So the argument is at the end of the day that you want to export more than you import. So you want a positive balance of trade, so as opposed to a trade deficit. And by building local industry and keeping out foreign products, you're encouraging people to buy local products, thus to use your local currency, and you don't have to import as many products as you would otherwise need to if you did not have the local industries. Okay. The promotion of exports. So by developing local industries and protecting these local industries, eventually these industries become strong, and then they're able to export their goods to other countries. So by making your local industry stronger, it creates more opportunities for your businesses to be able to export goods and services. The eighth example is anti-dumping remedies. Okay, I'll come to dumping later on, but the bottom line is that countries that have a surplus of a particular product will often dump that product in another country, i.e. they will sell it at a loss or at a greatly reduced price just to get rid of that product. So the EU, the European Union, European Economic Union, subsidizes its farmers, so it encourages them to produce various agricultural products, and that means that they can export those products at a greatly reduced rate. The problem with that is that local farmers cannot necessarily compete with the prices that my European farmers are charging because they are subsidized. Thus, the local farmers go out of business by the European farmers dumping their cheap products in the South African market. Then, political objectives or retaliation. We're seeing this very actively in the trade war between China and the United States. So when Donald Trump is unhappy with China, he places tariffs on their goods and services, or he places tariffs on goods and services when countries do not want to toe the line. South Africa, who does not vote with the United States and the United Nations regularly, has seen various trade agreements revoked with the United States because we do not support them in the larger political context, and they retaliate against us based on our not voting with them in the United Nations by withdrawing certain agreements that reduce tariffs or import duties on goods that we send to the United States. Countries also want to protect their national sovereignty, so they do not necessarily want to rely on other countries for their livelihood. So they will often create industries within the country that ensure their independence. So countries want to be able to basically decide on their own way forward. They decide on what institutions, key matters, political, socio-economic systems, etc., So a country will often start industries to protect their sovereignty. For instance, South Africa during the apartheid era started Arms Corps to produce our own arms and weapons. They started Sasol to produce oil or petrol from coal, or two industries that were directly aimed to counteract sanctions against the country, and basically so that the former apartheid government could continue to exist. Okay, so what are the implications of trade barriers? Trade barriers are not as straightforward as they would appear. They are arbitrary and discriminatory, i.e., so the United States put in a tariff on all steel that is imported to the United States of 25% in order to protect their own industries. But the problem with that is it is applied to any foreign steel. So even if it comes from a country that does not produce steel at a particularly cheap price, they still land up with a 25% premium on the price of their products before they can enter the United States market. The tax people at the borders require special training, and there needs to be special administration and supervision to implement these trade barriers and tariffs. But what is interesting is that often these barriers lead to other microeconomic problems. So what do I mean by that? So the United States has put a tariff on steel imports in order to protect their own steel producers. So what does that mean? A ton of steel that costs, let's say, $100,000 now costs $125,000 with the 25% tariff that the United States has placed on the import of steel. This is great for American steel producers because now they can compete. However, who uses steel? The building industry, the car manufacturing industry, the appliance manufacturing industry, etc. And all of their raw materials have become more expensive, and it's actually had the implication that a number of these businesses have closed down in the United States. For example, Harley Davidson, which is one of the iconic motorcycle manufacturers in the United States, has moved their manufacturing out of the United States because of the tariffs placed on steel. So they protected jobs in the steel industry and lost jobs in the motor manufacturing industry. Also, special interests tend to push their privileges. So agriculture may ask that their tariffs instituted to look after their industries and interests, which is great if these industries need protection, but this often carries on long after it is required and can place these industries again at an unfair advantage over their competitors in other countries. And then finally, increased government intervention never bodes well for running any economy because, as mentioned earlier, it often has a whole lot of unforeseen consequences that result from their initial interventions. So guys, a tariff. What is a tariff? A tariff is a tax levied on goods, input materials and services imported into a country. So it's a tax that is levied on top of the price of specific goods or raw materials or particular types of services when they enter a country. So a percentage is added on top of the price of those goods before they can be imported into the country. So a levy is where a tariff is generally expressed as a percentage. A levy is attached to the total quantity of items imported. So it's a specific rate per unit. So for example, if there's a 20 Rand levy on whiskey, it will be 20 Rand per bottle of whiskey, whether it is some other cheap plonk from who knows where, or whether it is Chivas Regal whiskey. Every bottle of whiskey gets hit with the same 20 Rand levy. So a levy is a fixed amount of money on each unit imported. So this is called a specific tariff. So an example here is, let's say country A produces towels. The slide is slightly obscured, but let's say country A produces towels for $10 or $12 each. And country B produces for $10. So they've got an unfair advantage over the local industry. So country A places a 20% tariff to the price of goods from country B so that they can compete equally, or they could even add a higher tariff to protect their local industry and make their local products more attractive in the marketplace. Okay, there are various types of tariffs. Ad valorem tariffs is based on a percentage of the value of the imported item. So in my example, guys, let's say it's a bottle of whiskey. If the ad valorem tax is 20%, then 20% will be added to the price of the bottle of whiskey that is imported into the country. So that means if you're importing cheap whiskey at 50 Rand a bottle, 10 Rand will be added, but if it is 500 Rand a bottle, 100 Rand will be added to the price of the whiskey. Export tariffs are payable on goods that are leaving the country, goods or services. Why would we want to do that? The government may want to discourage industries from exporting certain goods from the country. For example, let's say agricultural products. You don't want all your wheat going to be used for biofuel or for corn syrup or whatever in the USA, because you need to feed your own population. So you add export tariff onto it to make your goods less attractive to foreign buyers and thus more likely to be used in the local market. Then transit tariffs is a tax that government charges on goods moving through the country. There are two reasons behind this. The one is simply because the government can, so it's a way of generating revenue for the country. So if, for example, country B needs to get its goods through country A charges a transit tariff, so a tax on all of those goods in order to produce revenue for their budget. The other idea with the transit tariffs is that the transport of goods and services through a country reaps a toll on the infrastructure of the country, so you need to recoup the costs of, for example, your roads getting damaged and carbon that's been emitted with the goods traveling through your country, etc. Another tool that is available to governments to protect their local industries is subsidies. Now, how a subsidy works is the government provides a financial payment to domestic manufacturers or service providers to reduce the cost of manufacturing. So the bottom line is they want to reduce the cost price of the goods manufactured within the country so that they can be sold at a cheaper price. So it has a strategic motive, i.e. to protect local industry, but also that local industry can grow. So for instance, you want to subsidize your farmers to make sure that they don't give up on farming because of cheap imports, etc., because farming is a strategic industry that is important to the overall welfare of the country. So, subsidies discourage foreign imports. They make local goods cheaper, and therefore it makes the local market less attractive for foreign producers of goods because they cannot compete on price with your local guys because the government is already giving them part of their production costs. So it reduces the desire for imported products, etc. Okay. You note there it says amongst rational consumers because things like brand and status and that also still play a role. But it also enables countries to gain export markets. So it makes the goods that you export cheaper and therefore more attractive to foreign buyers. So it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it discourages foreign products in your local market, and it gives you an advantage in foreign markets with your products because they are cheaper. Then the government may also place quotas on goods. A quota is the most prominent non-tariff barrier. Okay, so quotas restrict the amount of goods or services that can be imported into a country over a specific period of time. So normally a accounting year, etc., which is from February to March of the next year, I think. Okay, so how that works is, for example, in South Africa, the South African government has placed a quota on the amount of Chinese clothing that can come into South Africa, thus protecting local manufacturers from cheap imported clothing. So it limits the amount of the product that can be imported. So I just put up another slide over here in terms of import quota, restriction on the quantity of goods that can be imported into a country. But it often has the consequence that one country will retaliate against another country. So you put in quotas to protect local markets, but then the country which is exporting the goods may very well put its own quotas in place on certain goods that you export to that country. So it can have the consequence that the foreign country retaliates against your country. So the three key types of quotas are, firstly, import quotas, which is the most prominent direct restriction. So you require an import license to import certain types of goods, and this will state what quantity of this good that you can import at the end of the day. So, for example, the Edcon Group could get a quota or import license to import, let's say, 100,000 items of Chinese clothing within a calendar year, and they could not import any more than those 100,000 items. The second one is voluntary export restraint. Here, a restraint, instead of putting a tariff on the goods that are exported, the exporters are limited in the amount of goods that they are allowed to export. So let's say my wheat farmers, South Africa has calculated that we need 20,000 tons of wheat a year to feed our population. But our market produces 25,000 tons of wheat. Now, my farmers are getting, let's say, 10,000 Rand a ton for wheat in South Africa and 15,000 Rand a ton in the USA. So instead of placing a punitive tariff on these farmers, what the government does is allow the farmers to export 5,000 tons of their wheat and no more. So they can still take advantage of the higher prices that they can get overseas while protecting their local food supplies. The third type is called local content requirements. Okay, so government may require that a manufacturer or an importer includes a percentage of components that were produced locally. So, for example, Toyota has a car manufacturing plant in East London. Now, they could import all of the parts for those cars, but the government says if you want to have your manufacturing plant here, you need to ensure that 40% of each car is manufactured locally. So what would Toyota do? They would source their tires, windscreens, seats, and other components from South Africa, and perhaps import things like the car bodies and engines from other parts of the world. Fourth type of quota is a binational restriction. So here, it can be voluntary, but it's often is, for example, in the case of government tenders, that they will only purchase goods that were manufactured in the local country. So the South African government, for example, will only buy goods or services manufactured locally. And then finally, we have something called a technical barrier. A technical barrier is where, is it finally? Anyhow, a technical barrier a technical barrier is where a country creates particular technical specifications for the products in its market. A good example of this is the plugs that are placed on our appliances in South Africa. So in South Africa, we've got a specific type of plug that limits that other countries can just come and dump appliances here that they have not sold in their markets, because it means that you have to change the plug in order to use the appliance in South Africa. And also we have a requirement that the plug has to be fitted on any appliance that is sold in South Africa. So it makes it more difficult for foreign suppliers just to come and dump goods here that were produced for another market. Another example is that we use 220 volts for our appliances, but in other countries, or some other countries, they use 110 volts appliances, which again means that you cannot just transfer an appliance from one country to another. Okay, I spoke about dumping already, but dumping occurs when the goods, or when goods are exported at a price less than their normal value, or less than they can be produced in the local market. Okay, so an export firm offloads its excess domestic products to foreign markets. Okay, why would they do that? Okay. In the first place, they may just have a surplus of goods that cannot be sold. So my farmers in the EU have been subsidized to grow apples. They've grown hopelessly too many apples for the EU to consume. So what do? They export those apples to South Africa and sell them at basically next to nothing, because they've already made their profit because they were subsidized on their manufacture. Well, my local farmers cannot compete because the government does not subsidize the production of apples. The other reason that you get dumping is to unleash competitive pressures. In other words, a company comes into a country and it sells products at a very low price in order to drive existing players out of the marketplace. So let's say Great Wall Motors from China comes to South Africa and it sells its bakkies for 50,000 Rand each at a loss. But they've done this for a strategic reason, to drive the existing manufacturers of bakkies out of the market, so they cannot compete with them, they go bankrupt, and then after they've gone bankrupt, Great Wall Motors goes and increases the prices of their bakkies to more than the previous guys were charging, and therefore they reap greater profits and any losses that they incurred beforehand. So dumping governments want to discourage because it tends to damage local industries, because they go out of business because they cannot compete with the cheap imports. Now, again, I have placed some questions, or more questions at the back of this chapter. Okay, these are important for your exam. Once again, I listed them for the portfolio, but we will see how the assessments are conducted. But okay, there are how many questions? The first one, I'm just going to go over quickly. No. You can read the questions for yourself. Answer the questions for yourself, guys, before you go over the feedback, which I will put on the site separately. Thank you very much. So you got the first three questions over there, and so guys, total of 5 questions, but as again I say, they are important in the context of your final assessment. You must be able to answer these questions in order to pass the subject. Thank you. Okay, I didn't put that feedback on the slide. Anyhow.